Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Connecting with Nature webinar. So my name is Samantha Newton. I'm the Digital Communications Coordinator with NPA New South Wales, and very pleased to have today's webinar. So we're finding out more about the Bush Connects projects in the Illawarra Shoalhaven region. First of all, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're gathering on today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So for me, I'm on Camaragal country in the north side of Sydney, and I acknowledge that the land that we are on is very important. It's never been ceded, still is, always will be Aboriginal land. So today's webinar is very, very important project that NPA has. It's two projects, Bush Connect projects that run jointly by NPA New South Wales, Berry Landcare and other partners in the Illawarra Shoalhaven Great Eastern Ranges region of the south coast of New South Wales. And these are funded by the New South Wales Environmental Trust. So this webinar is going to be the final final of the Connecting with Nature series for this year, and very pleased to have all of you with us today. These webinars have been a fantastic opportunity to hear about so many different projects and places across New South Wales and across Australia, and also to hear about different walks and different activities that our members do and our members run, and also the wildlife across New South Wales and what makes our natural areas so special. So it's been absolutely fantastic to have the series and to have so many fantastic speakers. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We have two opportunities to comment. So there is, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of your screen or the top, depending on how it's set up, you will see that there's a chat function and also a Q&A function. So if you have any questions for our presenters, we appreciate it if you could put those into the Q&A. And if you have any sort of general comments, or if someone else asks a question and you know the answer, feel free to pop that into the chat function as well. And we will go to questions at the end of the presentation. And also this presentation is being recorded, and like all of our webinar presentations, it will be available on the NPA website within a week or so. So we hope you enjoy today's presentation. I'd just like to introduce our speakers today. So first of all, we have David Rush. David has worked with ACT and New South Wales conservation agencies, local governments and state agencies in conservation and land management. David worked in the role of the Illawarra Shoalhaven Great Eastern Ranges Regional Facilitator from 2012 to 2015, and has been the project officer for the two Bush Connect projects since 2016. Now, Kelvin Officer is our other presenter today. Kelvin and his wife, Kerry Navin, are the owners and principal archaeologists for Navin Officer Heritage Consultants. And they provide specialist cultural heritage conservation and management advice throughout Southeast Australia. Kelvin is the current volunteer chair of the Berry Landcare. So without further chit chat, thank you all very much for coming today. And I'll now hand over to David to lead off on the presentation. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for the opportunity to present in this webinar series. I hope that everybody enjoys the presentation. I just want to quickly start off by sharing my presentation screen and getting this cranked up. As Sam said, this is a presentation about two projects that the NPA has involvement in: the Berry Bush Links project and the Thin Green Line project, both funded by the New South Wales Environmental Trust under their Bush Connect program. So before I get into the nuts and bolts about the projects, I'm going to hand over to Kelvin, because you know, even before the Great Eastern Ranges region as an initiative was talking about setting up regional partnerships, Berry Landcare was already established and running. So I want to take us back to that time to set some the scene and give a bit of background information. Thanks, Kelvin.
Thanks, David. Yes, some background, and this background extends even before my executive role on Berry Landcare. But the group was established in 2004, and we were and still are an umbrella group of many volunteers spread over many different Landcare sites, at that time 10, we're now 12 sites, to work on both private and public land on Landcare projects. And there's always been an awareness within the group that the Berry area was a place blessed with remnant vegetation, which stretched from the coast up onto and into the Illawarra range. And we, from that time onwards, we survived with our volunteer resources, as well as some low to moderate level funding from local government and Southern Rivers Catchment Management and sources such as that. And our main focuses were revegetation, weed control, fencing, and feral animal control in particular. And we were that very early work was the establishment of partnerships and awareness raising of the values of the area, and particularly the corridor. And that's still an ongoing process to try and get that recognition within the community. We have been particularly interested in that corridor function, and that led to our project From the Escarpment to the Sea. And this was initially prior to the GER initiative. And we started building those relationships between volunteers and community groups to recognise those environmental values. So the original objectives there were to document the situation we had, to build on that capacity from landholders and our volunteer groups. And essentially our main objective was to achieve a functioning corridor. Next slide, David. At that stage, the federal government recognised quite a suite of federally recognised values. And you can see there, that's roughly the corridor, the Berry corridor, as we work within that area, extending from 7 Mile Beach National Park up into Barren Grounds Nature Reserve. And you can see there a list of some of the things that were federally recognised, including 2 listed threatened ecological communities, a vast array of valuable species, remnant habitats, and unfortunately 48 invasive species. David, next slide.
So thanks for that, Kelvin. That sets the scene of the early history before the Great Eastern Ranges stuff started kicking along. Now, so the precursor to the Great Eastern Ranges is based on some of these next few slides. And when we look at Australia and in terms of the National Reserve System we have across the country, you can see that you know, that the country is fairly well blessed with a plethora of national parks, nature reserves, Indigenous protected areas, and private conservation agreement lands, as well as World Heritage areas. But one of the things that strikes me when I look at a map like this is that even though, and particularly in Central Australia, there's some fairly large patches of reserved lands, most of these reserved lands are scattered, isolated, separated, fragmented, in other words, not connected. Now, they're important core areas for conservation. There's no doubt about that. And, you know, I don't need to tell the NPA members how important that is for future conservation works. They are the bastions of a lot of genetic diversity. But, you know, if we're going to protect these into the future, we need to be able to look at connectivity between the National Reserve System in Australia. And that's what the GER was really all about. And in the local area on the south coast, this is a picture of the lower Jamberoo Valley. these are some of the impacts that we're dealing with across the country, in fact, but, you know, this area, as much as any others, indicate the impacts being habitat loss, fragmentation, and of course, weed and feral animal impacts have been regarded now right across the nation as being major impacts to biodiversity loss as well. So the GER came up with this plan of let's work between the gaps between the national parks and get some partnerships established and getting some activities happening where we can, you know, conserve patches of bush and create corridors for wildlife. And that occurs between far north Queensland and central Victoria. There's a number of reasons why the Great Eastern Ranges region itself is important, and there's a whole list of things there. You know, for many of you, you'll know that it's where the majority of the Australian population live. It's where most of our rivers and fresh water comes from. But it's also important for plants and animals. And that eastern seaboard area, the Great Eastern Ranges of Australia, has some of the country's richest species and endemism, highlighted by the red on the two maps of Australia there on the left. And so that's one of the reasons why it makes the Great Eastern Ranges such an important area to focus on. And there's some pictures of some local critters that are important as well. Now, this slide indicates to us some information about the connectivity potential in New South Wales. So that map on the left-hand side with the red highlighted shows where the greatest opportunities are for, you know, forest and habitat connectivity in New South Wales. And although the Great Eastern Ranges is very much a sort of north-south running initiative, if you like, it's not just the north-south capacity that it has that it's important, but also working on, you know, and in terms of animals being able to move between national park areas, but we also need to think about how animals can move from lower to higher elevations to deal with the impacts of climate change. So probably back in about, I think, 2006-07, maybe 2008, the Great Eastern Ranges initiative really started kicking off, and there was a few partnerships that were operating in New South Wales at that time. And then in 2011, funding was obtained from the New South Wales Environmental Trust to work on these 8 partnership areas across New South Wales. And I just want to highlight the area of the Illawarra Shoalhaven being the area that I started working in late 2011. These areas were based on some of these factors that you can see here, being that there may already have been conservation action plans in place, some produced by catchment management authorities and other organisations. There was already a lot of engagement going on, social research and science and governance as well. So in late 2011, we had a forum at the University of Wollongong for the Illawarra Shoalhaven area. Many different government and community organisation representatives were invited. That's the group you can see there. And we talked about the need for having a Great Eastern Ranges partnership established in the Illawarra Shoalhaven region. And then we basically put out a call to the floor of all those people in attendance as to who would want to be involved in this partnership moving forward. And I think we had about 9 partners volunteer for that from both community and government agencies. So this is where the National Parks Association really starts to shine in terms of its involvement in the Great Eastern Ranges by putting up its hand to be the lead partner in the Illawarra, Shoalhaven, Great Eastern Ranges region. And back then it was Kevin Evans, the CEO of the NPA, helping with that. And Kevin was great. He was fantastic. So the funding back then was for about 3 to 4 years, and it helped to fund the partnership activities. It helped to fund me to support the Illawarra Shoalhaven GER partnership, and with some seed funding for some kick-started projects in the area. So the region that we focused on, this is a map, but probably it's a bit hard to see, but basically in the northern part, the top part of the map, you've got Royal National Park and the Greater Blue Mountains region over there. And then we run down through Wollongong and then down through the south coast area past Nowra and all the way down to Bateman's Bay in the south. And we've got Moreton National Park sort of along the western boundary. So what did we do? We worked on what our structure, vision, purpose, aims and objectives would be. We then went through a very detailed process to identify where the community capacity and environmental needs and issues were in the Illawarra Shoalhaven. Out of that, we created a focus corridor summary and identified 10 corridors, potential focus corridors where we could operate. And the structure also allowed us to have various partners, associates, sponsors and supporters, as is indicated by that picture, that image there. So the 10 focus corridors that we identified back then, this is in about 2013, 2014, were already underpinned by a number of other plans and documents that had been produced. So we didn't reinvent wheels. We basically said, well, what's out there already and what can we build on to create these focus corridors, not only in a north-south way, but also that elevation from escarpment areas down towards the seaboard. So plans like the Illawarra Escarpment Management Plan, the Illawarra Biodiversity Strategy, the South Coast Regional Plan, the Southern Rivers Catchment Action Plan. These were some of the plans that underpinned our corridor mapping. And remember, this was also overlapped with community capacity. Where do we currently have community groups operating already, and what are they doing? We also looked at, in terms of environmental needs, some of the threats and opportunities and so forth that that were occurring, and indeed threatened species and threatened ecological communities. So that, as that started to wind up, we then morphed into the period where the New South Wales Environmental Trust provided funding to the tune of about $8 million for ongoing projects under their Bush Connect program. And so NPA, I worked with NPA and our other partners, and we established 2 applications. We were the only group in New South Wales to successfully achieve the 2 funded projects that we applied for, being the Berry Bush Links project and the Thin Green Line project. And we'll get into exactly where they operate and the sort of things that we did and have been doing in those areas shortly. But basically it's the Environmental Trust that was similar to their Save Our Species program in terms of its funding structure. So it would provide 6 years of funding, but the project would actually go for 10 years. So it relies heavily on volunteer involvement in the last 4 years. Personally, I don't like this style or this structure of program. I think it's much better to have a set period of time which is funded, but not rely on volunteers to fund other components in ongoing years afterwards. Anyway, we worked with our partners and established landholder and project agreements and forms, and we had targets of 50 sites for both projects to work on. The types of agreements that we offered landholders were in 3 forms. at the basic level or sort of early or light green entry level for landholders type of agreement is a land for wildlife registration on their property. That would provide them with a bit of funding once their property was registered. Probably the heavy lifting of our project work was done by our project term agreements. These are 10-year agreements that the landholder signs up for, where they get in the first year they get funding for various things, and then they provide the in-kind contributions in the following 9 years of the 10-year agreement. And the third level was the BCT conservation agreements or conservation covenants. These are the sorts of agreements that are applied to a landholder's title and is generally funded through the Biodiversity Conservation Trust. The agreements are done through them as well. So let's get into some detail about the first project, Berry Bush Links project. And feel free to jump in here, Kelvin, if you want to kickstart with some discussion about who these people are.
Still before my time, David. But
Okay, all right. Well, the guy in the white shirt with a big grin on his face is local member, New South Wales member, Gareth Ward. We invited Gareth Ward to come along and help us launch the success of the Berry Bush Links funding. And next to Gareth Evans, as you look at the picture on the left-hand side, it was the then chair of Berry Landcare, Will Armitage. There's some other members of Berry Landcare in there, but there's also some of our project partners, which included Southern Rivers Catchment Management Authority, that became Southeast Local Land Services. Kevin Evans is in there behind Gareth from the NPA. There's a representative from local council, another representative from New South Wales Sport. There's a couple of landholders, and there's also Lynn from the local school nursery, which is run by volunteers.
third from the right. Yeah.
Thanks. So the sorts of things that the projects funded included weed and feral animal control, tree planting, stakes and guards. We provided funding for fencing materials, but the installation of fences were the landholder's contribution. We also funded various workshops and landholder training. We also included feral animal, the vertebrate pest control training. So we actually paid local land services to deliver some of their training workshops to authorise landholders to use 1080 baits and pindone and pest ejectors and the like. And we also amalgamated those with National Parks Association's Who's Living on My Land motion camera workshops, which were very successful. In the Berry Bush Links project area, we're also funding a landholder guidebook, which is almost complete. We've funded some research from the University of Wollongong, and that's ongoing. And the project funding also paid me 2 days a week for each project to coordinate much of the work and do all the heavy lifting and site visits with landholders, signing agreements, drawing up agreements, photographs, reporting and such. And so here we have just a number of photographs showing you some of the before and after effects of some of the work that we've been carrying out. So starting off with weed control, there's a couple of pictures on the left-hand side there showing before and after camphor laurel control. Now that particular property had more than 180 camphor laurel trees growing on the property, which we controlled, mostly through stem injection, drill and fill. The photos on the right, that's controlling lantana and replanting with local native species. There's more lantana on another site, before and after photographs. Lots of tree planting happening. One in particular, which is quite a large component of our project and another one of our partners with National Parks and Wildlife Service is Campbell's Run. It's a small area adjacent to Coomanderi Swamp. And we've had various volunteers involved, and so far I think we've planted over 1,500 trees in that area and still have another couple of thousand to plant. Plenty of other tree planting sites as well. We've been operating with lots of different volunteers, which has included high school groups, local Landcare volunteers and other members of the community. We've done National Tree Planting Days. We've had a number of visits from the University of Technology Sydney Big Lift teams, plenty of involvement.
These pictures highlight the challenge of trying to find areas to plant to try and link up pockets or islands of remnant vegetation, which I think we've been reasonably successful at in trying to do this and harnessing community sources of volunteering, especially when other sources such as the Green Army dried up.
That's right. And here's a couple of examples of some sites that we've fenced. So it's really just a short snapshot, a bit of a taste of the entire work that's been going on. And we'll show you a slide soon of the achievements in both of the projects soon. The involvement of University of Wollongong's scientific research has been pretty important for the project as well. One of the ways, I mean, you can take a photograph of a site that previously had no fencing and now it does, or that previously had weeds and now doesn't, and that's all well and good. But how do we back up the work that we're doing is actually helping for native animals and creating corridors? Well, I think one of the things that we can do is we can actually do some scientific study, and the University of Wollongong has been looking at greater gliders and other gliders in both of the project areas. Some of the work we did identified that we had a very healthy population, probably one of the biggest in New South Wales, of fishing bats. We've had the university trap small to medium-sized ground-dwelling mammals and take genetic sampling. The idea being that if with that base level data, that's been across the corridor, and with that base level data, we can go back and trap animals and take genetic samples and see if they're actually moving around the landscape. The idea being that if the genetic sampling shows genetics moving into other areas, then the corridor work that we're doing is actually working, and hopefully also the feral animal control work as well. So here's some detail in relation to the Berry Bush Links project and some of the sites that we've managed to get on board. Now, there's some different colours there, and the key shows you that orange areas are basically state or local government public land sites. The blue areas are private land sites. Some of the yellow sites, which are more linear than anything else, are community lands. It could be Crown land and council land, and the green areas are national parks. And you can see that 7 Mile Beach National Park is right on the seaboard there. And the aim of the Berry Corridor is to try and create linkages between 7 Mile Beach National Park in the southeast up to Barren Grounds Nature Reserve in the north. So now some information about the Thin Green Line project. One of the reasons why this site was chosen, and interestingly, if I just go back a couple of slides, if you look at the state map there, you can see that the Berry Bush Links site, BBL, is very closely almost linked to the Thin Green Line project area. So just north of that project area, north of Barren Grounds, with a small gap is then the bottom of the Thin Green Line project area. And so the reason why this area was chosen was because we identified as the partnership that this is a bit of a choke point in terms of forest connectivity. As in fact, in that area, just below where it says Illawarra Highway, this is believed to be the thinnest point of forest connectivity between Newcastle and the Victorian border. So that's where we put the Thin Green Line project and focused the activities. We also knew there were existing community groups operating in the area as well. So escarpment areas, some of you probably know that escarpment areas are very rich with biodiversity. We also have plenty of different wet forests, rainforests, and interesting threatened species. And we would again try and engage with landholders with the similar agreements that I mentioned before in the Berry Bush Links project. Well, that's what the escarpment looks like from Mount Murray. This is looking sort of southeast. If any of you have ever been to visit the Illawarra Fly, it's just over the back of that high point on the top right of the picture. So I mentioned before, there's a number of rainforest areas. There's tall eucalypt forest on basalt soils. There's Robertson Rainforest. There's a nationally critically endangered forest community that occurs up near the Robertson area. Look, you know, it's a rich area when it comes to ecological communities. And of course, not to forget the different species. You know, there's potoroos and there's sooty owls and powerful owls and broad-headed snakes, and there's bloody koalas and spotted quolls. There's all sorts of different animals. So it's pretty rich with biodiversity. More than 40 species listed in New South Wales, in New South Wales legislation. And of course, there are some protected areas, but the project focuses on working in the gaps between the national parks to get those linkages. Some of the issues to deal with, I mentioned feral animals before, so there's plenty of feral cats, there's foxes across the landscape. In the Illawarra escarpment, deer, there are 4 different species of deer that occur along the escarpment, and that's a growing problem. They also cause a lot of car accidents, and for that reason alone, they're an important issue to deal with. There's feral goats, there's rabbits, and in some areas, fortunately, we're spared of feral pigs, but they are pressing on the edges of some of these corridor areas that we've been working on. And of course, weed invasion, plenty of weeds, lantana being one of the big issues, but plenty of other weeds to deal with. And in the Thin Green Line project area, as I said, just below the orange line there is Barren Grounds Nature Reserve. So just below that is the linkage to Berry Bush Links. So they're almost linked together, but with a small gap in between. And yet again, many of the blue sites that you see there are private land sites that we've funded. The purple area that you can see there is Indigenous managed land by the Illawarra Aboriginal Land Council. So we've engaged with them. And not a great deal of council or public managed sites so much. So a bit different here. And of course, the other difference between the Thin Green Line project area and the Berry Bush Links project is that while the Berry Bush Links project really occurs on an area that only deals with one community effectively, the Thin Green Line project area, because of the nature of the topology in the area, straddling the escarpment with various different areas, you've got the upper Kangaroo River Valley area over here, you've got the Robertson locality here, you drop down the escarpment and you've got the Tongara area here, you cruise over the Stockyard Spur areas and you're into Curramore and Jamberoo Valley areas. So there's 4 or 5 different communities, and we straddle the border between 4 different local government areas as well, whereas the Berry Bush Links area deals with one local government, Shoalhaven local government. So this Thin Green Line project area is a little bit more challenging because of those issues. This slide's really just saying that we found long-nosed potoroos in some of the motion camera workshops that we did. So we also found foxes were pretty ubiquitous across the country. So we engage with, in a concentrated way, the landholders around Mount Murray to do fox control, and we engaged the contractor to actually check traps and dispatch foxes that were trapped and so forth. We also caught some feral cats in this project area as well. Been plenty of tree planting happening. This is a 2 hectare site that we've planted out at Carrington Falls. Blackberry is an issue, stuff like English holly and other issues to deal with as well. We've also funded fencing for tall eucalypt forest on basalt soils, and also fencing materials to fence off Robertson Rainforest patches. We conducted plenty of workshops in the area. I mentioned vertebrate pest control. We've also done Who's Living on My Land workshops, loaning out lots of cameras to landholders, and also we've just recently started to run some of our hotspots bushfire workshops. First, we ran our first workshop in the Thin Green Line project area, and we'll soon run one in the Berry area. One of the nifty little products that's come out of the funding in the Thin Green Line project area has been the writing of the second edition of the Robertson Rainforest book. So the first edition is the one you can see there, which is sort of a bit more black and white and a bit bland. In fact, that book had originally black and white photographs, black and white drawings, black and white maps, and a copy of that was given to me by one of the Robertson Environment Protection Society members, who's one of our partners, and that's members there on the top left-hand photograph there. And so we provided some of the funding to produce the second edition of the Robertson Rainforest book, which you can see on the right-hand side. Now, it has colour maps, colour photographs, and other coloured drawings and stuff, and it's a much better product now. It's beautiful, and we managed to, in between COVID, we managed to do a launch. Over 120 people attended the launch back in May earlier this year, and that photo is participants at the launch, bottom left-hand side. So what have we achieved so far? Because these two projects are still ongoing. We have managed to get a 1-year extension from the Trust. And so these are our project outcomes for both projects. And I won't read them all out because there's a fair bit of stuff there, but you can see that we've been pretty busy. There's been a lot going on. We are on track to hit many of our targets. I think we hope to plant about 14,000 native tube stock in the Berry Bush Links project area, and about 10,000 in the Thin Green Line project area as well. But it has been a little bit difficult. The early days of the project, we're dealing with issues of drought. We lost some of our expected project supports when the federal government axed the Green Army project. The Conservation Volunteers Australia was lost to us in the local areas. And so we were heavily reliant on some of these groups for some of the volunteer work that we would have involved in the project. So we've had to find other partners who can provide that. Fortunately, in the Berry Bush Links area, we've managed to get some support from the corrective services people in 2 different streams, and they've been helping quite a bit, although they've also been affected by COVID lockdowns, and for the last 2 years, we haven't really seen them. I mentioned that it's challenging working across multiple local government areas, and where you've got separated communities. So the Thin Green Line project areas really struggle with that a bit, but the Berry Bush Links project, being effectively one community, has not had that sort of issue really to speak of. Calvin, you might want to jump in here while I take a quick drink and catch my breath.
Yes, the other triumvirate, of course, has been the pandemic and the fire impacts, and of course the drought that we had. So they've all combined to offer up challenges in terms of getting our volunteers on the ground to plant. The other major challenge has been the administrative side of it, which David has managed to successfully negotiate through, but it does highlight the fact that we are very limited in the funded positions that we have in this project. And we rely a lot upon volunteers, and it is quite onerous when there is a lot of administrative requirements and a lot of reporting to justify our expenditure.
So this is why it's been really important to have the NPA involved, because they've done a lot of the heavy lifting of helping with the financial management, handling the payments, managing payments to landholders and to contractors, and my position as well. Something which Berry Landcare really just didn't have the capacity to do, but you know, where they're limited in that respect, they've been fantastic at providing plenty of project assistance, planning assistance. We've had plenty of meetings, and they've been very helpful in helping to guide the project and liaise with the trust where we've needed to, various different aspects of the projects and so forth.
The role of the NPA has been critical to the success of both of these projects, and it's a wonderful asset for this type of conservation management.
And some of the other challenges that we've had to deal with during the project funding period has been things like the Berry Bypass roadworks. So the highway basically came through and cut and created a major barrier to wildlife movement right in the middle of the Berry corridor area. And something that we didn't expect was having to deal with rural residential subdivision and zoning applications by proponents that would effectively create barriers to our achieving wildlife corridors in the project area. So we ended up wading into some of those issues, even though we weren't not really paid to do that, or we didn't expect to have to get involved in that, but we felt we had to. And as that last point sort of says there, you know, and volunteers is really important to the project. Without them, it wouldn't really happen. And we count many of the landholders that we reach agreements with as volunteers as part of the project. So what are we going to do next? We have about 1 year left of funding from the trust to finalise both projects. So our focus over the next year is to complete our projects and hit our targets and do final reports to the trust. Just a little plug there for my position as sort of project manager or project coordinator, which the Landcare group and the other volunteer groups continually tell me is critical to the success of the projects. So that's important. But without that, many volunteer groups wouldn't be able to operate. I've been having discussions with Gary Howling from the GER about reforming an Illawarra Shoalhaven Great Eastern Ranges partnership next year. I think this is going to be important as we look at where we go next and where we try to apply for funding. We'll also be conducting some promotional and events things next year to celebrate our successes and also to promote our achievements. And that'll be an opportunity for us to engage with landholders who will still want some support going forwards in terms of their involvement in the projects. So that's where some of the that's where Berry Landcare will step up and assist some of those landholders that we have agreements with. We need to identify if National Parks Association wish to continue to be a lead partner or if we need to find a new one, because we still need to have that administration and finance management capacity by a group such as NPA going forward. And of course, we'll also at that time start mapping our priorities and options for continuing this work, because there's still a lot of work to do across the landscape. You know, if you look back at some of those maps where we've got agreements with landholders, there's still gaps between some of them. So there's still a lot of work that we could do, and we could start to expand the projects and link them both up, or indeed maybe even look at some of those other 8 potential corridor areas, focus corridor areas that we could work on. If we don't do that, then we miss out on capitalising on our achievements over the last 6 to 7 years. So this is a critical juncture for us moving forward. So I think it's important. And we're no different to any of the other Great Eastern Ranges funded regions that got money under the Trust's Bush Connect program. They'll all be looking at where they want to go next as well. So this last slide, just it's not complete. I did try to find logos for most of our partners, but these are some of the people who are involved right across both project areas. A lot of partners, and you know, partnerships, collaboration, it's the name of the game. And that's pretty much the end of the presentation. So thanks everyone for watching. We hope that you got plenty of value out of looking and listening to that. And thanks, Kelvin.
Thank you very much. Thanks, David. Thanks, Kelvin. That's a really good presentation. I've been around NPA long enough to see the beginning of both these projects, and after sort of a break to come back in and see where things are at. So I'm really enjoying hearing about both the projects, how far they've come, how much they've achieved, and also what's next for you guys and what's next for the project. So thank you both very much. Much appreciated. We do have a couple of questions. I'd like to kick off. So obviously the impact of the droughts and the fires and then followed by COVID has been a challenge that this type of project is really vulnerable to. What I'm wondering is, with the next steps, with the year that's coming, and also with the changing weather patterns, so moving into a La Nina, if you are feeling more positive, like more optimistic about making up some of the lost ground in the next year or so?
Weeds are certainly making hay, so to speak, and it gets higher and higher. We're using periscopes at the moment.
Ladders.
It is a welcome change to be able to plant right across the season rather than being restricted to a growing season or a planting season.
Yes.
That has been good.
Yeah, the optimal season to try and get everything in until it gets too hot to plant. So I think we've been lucky this year. I don't know if that's has sort of the narrow window between restrictions easing and the warm weather about to hit. So
exactly.
Yeah.
Hopefully it'll be a cool summer and have a longer planting season as well as growing season.
The rain we've had since the drought broke, which was, you know, sort of culminated in the major bushfire disaster across southeast Australia, resulted in a lot of localised flooding. So we went out of being, you know, the difficulty of trying to plant during a drought and you know, a bit of hesitancy from landholders to, oh, it's raining now, but it's actually flooding in some of our areas. So, and our focus shifted during the drought to low-lying areas that might have still been holding some water. And of course, those were the areas that got flooded. So we had to deal with that as well. But at least, you know, landholders say, you know, you can't make money out of dust, but you can make money out of mud. So at least they prefer rainy and dry. And for us, the season of planting has extended, and you know, we're still considering planting even at the moment. When before in the drought we wouldn't have done that. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, that's a good sign. Excellent. Okay, so a couple of questions. So one from Gary. Quick question: who helped with the mapping? It's obviously a very useful aid to visualization of the issues.
Yeah, so some of the initial early mapping was done by Berry Landcare, perhaps with a bit of assistance from the Southern Rivers Catchment Management Authority, and that was sort of pre-GER time. And then as we kicked off as an Illawarra Shoalhaven Regional Partnership, Illawarra Regional Partnership, we had assistance from Great Eastern Ranges with some of that mapping. So very helpful to have GER involved. And because some of our partners included OEH and the like, they have mapping capacity as well. So,
oh, that's great. That's really, really good. Yeah, very handy to have those. Yeah,
and the mapping process was really involved. Like, we really sort of went into great level of details about where could we work, what sort of issues are being covered by what community groups and agencies, and we went through the whole box and dice. So it was quite a long process and quite involved. Yeah,
very valuable.
The mapping certainly helps you to select the areas of strategic concern. When you're talking about networking and connecting habitats, the mapping is a key factor in your strategy.
Actually, just on that with the key areas. So you mentioned with the thin green line, how there's different, so there's some identifying council-owned land, but not necessarily getting a lot of traction with council on accessing or in keeping that land involved in the project, and a few different councils as well. Is it a large area of council-owned land that ideally you would be able to bring into the project?
Not so much in the Thin Green Line project focus area. It's just different to the Berry Bush Links in that there's not a huge amount of council managed lands in those in that focus area. But so the biggest area of community managed land, I suppose, is the national parks areas, the Macquarie Pass, and some other portions of Butteroo National Park and so forth.
Okay, yeah, great. Okay, I have another question from Gary. This is a longer one. What are the chances of the project actually moving up to northern Illawarra escarpment? So there's many pinch type issues here, for example, Helensburgh and Otford, as well as degraded lands on new addition to Heathcote National Park at Garrawarra Hospital. Also vital links to Royal National Park, catchment lands and Darawal reserves. Is there any scope for that in the next steps?
Yeah, look, I think these are some of the challenges about, how we move forward. And, with a reformed partnership, whatever we call it, Illawarra Shoalhaven Regional Partnership, it may say, yep, that our priority is going to be focused in the northern Illawarra area, or it might be way down in the southern Shoalhaven area. It really depends on who the partners are going to be and what we decide we need to work on going forward. I think the critical thing will be that we should not forget what we've been able to achieve so far in the past 6 years, and building on that may mean that we continue to focus on the core areas we've achieved, but expanding on those. So I don't know. The answer is sort of up in the air at this stage. It will depend on who the people are that are involved in the future and who wants to be involved, and where the project focus will go.
Okay, great. I have another question here, and I'm not sure I'm going to be asking this right, so hopefully it makes sense. What is your approach to land use management or land management of fire in the landscape?
Yeah, so look, that's why we've got the hotspots workshops happening as part of both projects. I've got a bit of history working in fire myself, both for conservation agencies and also with the Rural Fire Service. And I think the hotspots is a really good way to engage with landholders on the issue of fire, threats of fire, using fire as a tool, and the kind of project work that we're doing with these Bush Connect programs, because it's a really good fit. Hotspots doesn't just look at, you got to burn areas off to save life and property. It looks at environmental issues as well, and how you can get a best fit for fire management in your area. Yeah,
okay. That's good. The hotspots, so that's a partnership with, is that the Nature Conservation Council?
Yeah, so RFS and NCC
and RFS,
pretty much run the hotspot stuff, but just so happens that I'm also the NCC volunteer rep on the Shoalhaven BFMC. So it's good. It's good because I'm across some of the issues and don't mind talking about it. And I noticed that Bill and Leslie Piggott have mentioned have said that it might be worth mentioning some of the other collaboration in the Berry Bush Links project.
Yep.
The Roads and Maritime Services main contractor was Fulton Hogan with the Berry Bypass Roadworks, and they were really good in assisting with some of the processes. Berry Landcare got in very early in the piece, consulting with the RMS to install 5 wildlife underpasses under the highway. Personally, I think they were more like drainage, engineered drainage things, but with a tag of wildlife underpass. But they do provide access for wildlife, and so that was something that may not have happened otherwise if the group hadn't have got into that engagement with RMS. So Fulton Hogan also agreed to do quite a bit of stuff, which included helping to support the local berry school nursery, which is run by volunteers, and a lot of the local seeds collected by volunteers, grown, propagated by the unit, and then sold on to landholders. And we purchase a lot of our plants from them. Fulton Hogan actually have supported that propagation unit through funding, which has been great. And they also did so. RMS also looked for biodiversity offsets as a part of excising some of the land areas in the Berry Bushlinks area, and so they ended up finding. We helped to broker and find some landholders that achieved our conservation covenants part of the project, but that was supported by RMS and Fulton Hogan as well.
That's excellent. It's good to see there was some attempt to address the connectivity across the highway. Is there any
to that end,
above as well?
Yeah, there were rope overpasses as well as part of the underpasses. So there was a combination, particularly focusing on those areas where there was still remnant vegetation and the highway was going through those areas.
RMS also installed something to the tune, well over 100 nest boxes, bird and bat boxes, and they have conducted some monitoring of those. So that was also part of the agreement that they would put these things in place.
Excellent. We've got a couple more minutes. There's a question here. Can you make any further comment on Indigenous involvement in both projects?
You want to take this one, Kelvin?
Some of the project has looked at locations and worked in locations that have Aboriginal significance, including Moyen Hill, which is mostly a council-owned land, and so we have been working closely with some of the Aboriginal members in Shoalhaven City Council, who've worked with weed control and other programs there, and the project has also been involved in recording some Aboriginal sites which were encountered during our survey work. So we have tried to work closely with the Gerinja community, who have a particular stakeholder and a traditional owner role in this corridor.
Excellent.
And in the Thin Green Line project area, I mentioned that there's some Indigenous managed lands managed by the Illawarra Aboriginal Land Council, and we also engaged with their green team and funded them to do some weed control and bush regeneration on various sites in the Thin Green Line project area as well.
Fantastic. Just a final question from me. I'm interested in the various agreements that are being formed as part of the two projects. So you've got the Land for Wildlife, the project term agreement, and the Conservation Trust agreements. Has there been, I guess what I'm curious about is how many agreements there were, if some were more popular, some types are more popular than others, and if you've identified barriers that could be addressed, obviously not by us or by you guys, but perhaps by the organisations that actually make the instruments.
Certainly we knew in advance that we probably wouldn't get a great deal of take up of landholders with conservation covenants. So we only had a few in each project. And indeed, we've hit our targets of 2 conservation covenants with the Berry Bushlinks project, but so far we haven't achieved our 3 with the Thin Green Line project area. But I'm continually looking for landholders where their properties might fit within the sort of properties that they're looking for, the BCT. One of the things about the 10-year agreements really are the heavy lifting. We have more of those than anything else in both projects. Land for Wildlife is a really good way to engage with landholders initially because it's easy, doesn't affect their title, doesn't cost them any money. It doesn't continue on with the property and won't affect the resale in any way, shape or form. And you don't know where it might lead. Like it might lead on to other things, and it could even lead to a conservation covenant eventually. You don't know. So it's a good entry level.
It's a good question because it highlights one of the challenges that we have in these sorts of projects, in that there is an increasingly fast turnover of land ownership in this area as land ownership, as land values skyrocket. There is increasingly more turnover and we get a complete change in the type of landowner. And people are reticent to enter into those more permanent covenant type relationships. So it is an increasing challenge, and you have to draw upon your educational resources to convince people. Yeah.
We've also had some challenges with non-permanent landholders. In other words, they own their property but they live elsewhere. They only come down to their property occasionally. And one of the things that we achieved in the Berry Bush Links project, and this was advice from one of our previous Great Eastern Ranges partners who worked for council in the planning section, and it was to include in our agreements with landholders, our 10-year agreements, that the landholder agrees to have the site mapped in council's biodiversity mapping. Now, what that does is it doesn't necessarily make an on title covenant with the property, but what it does is it creates a flag in council system where if a future development is, if the property's sold or if the landholder decides to split the property up and develop it or clear it or whatever, it just raises a flag in council because it goes into the LEP, and they'll ask more questions about what the intention of the development is before they'll approve it. So that sort of gives the site more life beyond the 10 years of the agreement that we've drawn up with the landholders. So that was
Yeah, and I'm guessing that survey work would also have the potential to reveal things to the landholder that they didn't realise were there, that are actually special, that make the landholder value the projects more.
Yeah, and certainly, motion cameras and things like that make a big difference, because we've heard the comments from landholders in the past that they say, "Oh, I don't have any feral animals on my property," and you put a camera on their property and you go, "Well, have a look at that." Exactly. Here's a fox, or here's a feral cat, or whatever, and they're a bit surprised by that. But sometimes it's just because they're not there at the time when the ferals are getting around and they don't see it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, we better wrap it up there. Lots of positive comments, which I'll forward on to you afterwards from our audience today. So thank you very much to Kelvin and David for being presenters today. Really appreciate your time. And thank you very much also to our audience for tuning in. As I said, this will be recorded, has been recorded, and will be on the website soon, probably in a few weeks as we take a bit of a break over Christmas. And the webinar series will restart in the new year as well. So thank you all for coming. Have a fantastic end of year break and look forward to seeing everyone in the new year. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelvin. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Cheers. Merry Christmas.
Thanks, Sam.